Welcome to the Power of Three interview series. You, InfluenceOlogy, and an expert. This is your friend here, Roberto Monaco, with InfluenceOlogy. And I'm really excited today to have a superstar with us, Daniel Pink. How's it going, Dan?
It's going great, Roberto. Thanks for having me on your program.
I'm really excited. Now, for those who haven't heard about Dan, a New York Times bestselling author. He wrote 4 books. I personally have read 2, and the books are Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. Phenomenal book. I read it, had a huge breakthrough because most of us think that money is one of the biggest motivators, and after read the book, realize that's not. The second book that I read, it's a phenomenal book, highly recommend, is A Whole New Mind, Why Right-Brainers Will Rule the Future. When I got this book, I was doing some research on storytelling then, and I found fascinating. The other 2 books that you wrote, I haven't read them yet. The Adventures of Johnny Bunko, The Last Career Guide You Ever Need, and then also wrote Free Agent Nation, The Future of Working for Yourself. His articles has been published in Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, Wire Magazine. Dan has been on CNN, CNBC, ABC, NPR, and I was reading your bio that I found fascinating. You served from 1995 to 1997 as a speechwriter to Vice President Al Gore. So it's really cool, man. Really cool background.
Thanks.
So here we go. When I'm actually on Dan's mailing list, and I received an email about his new book, To Sell is Human. And I went to Amazon and bought it right away. Can't wait to see it. And I emailed Dan and said, "Hey Dan, is there any way you can do a quick interview for us?" And he was kind to donate his Saturday morning here to donate his time. So I want to talk about this new book coming up in December, which I already ordered. So Dan, question number 1 here.
Yeah.
Why are we all in sales?
Well, that's really the key part of this book, To Sell is Human, Roberto, that we are all in sales now. And what you see here in the United States workforce is this. There's this myth out there that salespeople have been obliterated, disintermediated by the internet, that salespeople are going the way of meter maids and milkmen, and that's just not true. Before the rise in around 2000, you had 1 in 9 American workers were in sales. That is, their job was to try to convince someone else to make a purchase.
Okay.
Then, over the last 12 years, we've had widespread broadband, the rise of mobile phones and smartphones, tablets, social media, YouTube, all kinds of the internet has become even more fixed into our lives in ways that we scarcely imagined 12 years ago. Did it disintermediate salespeople? Today, we've got 1 in 9 people in the U.S. workforce who are in sales. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that, though it might be more interesting, is what happened to those other 8 out of 9. And those other 8 out of 9, they're in sales too. They might not be trying to convince someone to make a purchase. The end of their encounters might not have a cash register ringing, but they're spending enormous amounts of their time persuading, influencing, cajoling, trying to get people to part with resources, make an exchange. And we have data from a really interesting survey of 7,000 adult full-time workers showing that white-collar workers today are spending about 40% of their time in what we can think of as non-sales selling. So, like it or not, we're all in sales now. We're either doing traditional sales, trying to get someone to buy a Buick or a computer system, or we're non-sales selling. We're pitching ideas to our colleagues. We're trying to convince the boss to give up resources. But whatever we do, whatever our actual function is inside of a company or on our own, we're all in sales now.
Yeah, I love your little introduction from your new book that you said you analyze your schedule for the last, I think, 2 weeks. And you analyze and you realize, okay, I'm going to figure out what do I do every single day? And you broke down and you're either selling, influencing, pitching, idea selling. I love that part.
At some point, that's what we're doing right now. I'm answering your questions. We're having a good conversation. But ultimately, I am trying to convince your listeners that they should take this set of ideas seriously and that it's something that's useful for them to learn. And so right now is an example, in some cases, of non-sales selling.
I agree. Now, question number 2. I've been in America for 17 years now. When I got here, I started studying old school sales training. I got into Zig Ziglar, who just passed, and Tom Hopkins. Now, and a lot of times when you hear the word sales or sales training, people think, oh, sales has not changed much. It's the same thing. So the second question is this. Is sales is what it used to be, is the same thing, or has it changed?
I think it's a good question. I think it's changed dramatically in the last 10 years. I think, in fact, it's changed more in the last 10 years than in the previous 100. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Sales has a bad, as you suggested, Roberto, sales has a bad reputation. And again, if you look at, in the book, I have a word cloud that shows the results of a survey we did asking people, when you think of sales or selling, what's the first word that comes to mind? And if you look at the top 25 adjectives, the biggest one is pushy. Pushy, slimy, sleazy, cheesy, annoying, and has a very dim reputation. Yep. And I think, however, as I started thinking about this, I said, you know what? Maybe that view of sales, which is very widespread, is less about sales per se than about the conditions in which sales have long taken place. And here's what I mean by that. Most of what we know about sales, and certainly, Roberto, for you, 17 years ago, when if you took any kind of sales training, our whole notion of sales was built for a world of information asymmetry. The seller always had more information than the buyer. Yep. That was just a fact. That was a fact of life. Now, when the seller has more information than the buyer, the seller can rip you off. This is why we have the principle ingrained, the only two words of Latin most Americans know, caveat emptor, buyer beware. You have to beware when the seller has a huge information advantage on you. However, today, that information advantage that sellers have is eroding. Today, buyers can have almost as much information as sellers in many cases. Think about buying a car. Yep. You can walk into the Chevy dealership arguably knowing more about that particular make and model than the dealer, him or herself. You can go in with the factory invoice price. And so when that information asymmetry becomes something close to information parity, that changes the game. I mean, it changes the game it's a difference not in degree, but a difference in kind. It's a different kind of enterprise altogether. And so in that world, when buyers have as much information as sellers, and lots of choices, and the means to talk back via Twitter, Facebook, whatever, it's a different world. It's now seller beware, caveat emptor. And that plays by a very different set of rules, because if you try to rip me off, first of all, it's harder for you to rip me off. Second of all, if you do rip me off, I'm going to tell everybody. Yep. And so that low road, which is what we think of as sales, wasn't always the case, but that low road is less and less of an option for people, forcing us, again, whether we're in sales or non-sales selling, into the high road. That high road plays by a different set of rules, requires a different set of characteristics and abilities.
There's a huge shift in the power of information. I like that. So that's it. And I think it's interesting. It's happened at some level. It's happened so quickly that we haven't realized the implications of it. And at some level, as you're saying, we're kind of, certain approaches to sales are still built on a foundation of a world that doesn't exist anymore. Very powerful. I know the other day a guy called me and tried to sell me, and he used a technique. Can I come to office Tuesday or Thursday? I'm like, you still using that? Like,
yeah.
Like, you still using that?
Well, that's another good point too. Is that
double bind close, because actually backfire him, because I know he's doing. So it's like, he's still using that. I learned that 20 years ago, so I totally get it.
It is. It's actually a really good point, because not only is it the information about the products and services, but because there's just more information in general, we know a little bit more about some of these, very kind of pathetic tactics. And when we see them, they always. We can recognize them, and as you suggest, they backfire for the person using them. I had a guy come to my door about 2 years ago selling something or other, and he'd use the technique of asking questions, but only questions that would elicit a yes on my part. And I finally said to him, it's like, you can't kid a kidder. And I finally said to him, said, are you ever going to ask me a question that I can't answer yes? And he's like, oh, do I answer that yes or no? Funny. But I think what we have here is actually, much better informed buyers, both on the substance of the offering, but also, as you suggest, on the tactics of sales themselves.
Love it. So that leads me to the question number 3 that I have for you. What qualities that matter most now in moving and influence people into action?
So what I found is that it's, as I said, in a world of caveat venditor, it's a very different set of abilities. And again, the old school form of sales is ABC, always be closing.
Yeah.
From that, in part from that very famous scene in the movie Glengarry Glen Ross.
Yeah.
And I think that steamroller approach doesn't work anymore. It's outdated. It's for a world of again, it might work in a world of limited information, limited choices, and no way to talk back. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't work in a world where there's information parity, where buyers can talk back, and where they have plenty of options. And so I think the new ABCs are these: A, attunement; B, buoyancy; C, clarity. Attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. Those are the new ABCs. A, attunement. That is the ability to take another's perspective, really powerful in understanding where people are coming from. B, buoyancy. As you know, as all of us know who've done any kind of sales or any kind of non-sales selling, we operate in what one salesman described as an ocean of rejection. Okay. There's so much rejection. How do you remain buoyant and afloat in that ocean of rejection? And then C is clarity. And this is really important, is the counterpart of information parity is an explosion of information. Okay. So how do you move from accessing information to curating information? How can you move from solving problems to finding unknown problems? How can you frame your messages in ways that actually clarify the choices on the part of the person you're trying to move? So the new ABCs are attunement, buoyancy, and clarity.
I love it. Talk about clarity a little bit. I think in your previous book, the Whole New Mind, you talk about mini makers because there's so much information, and you talk about the people who are successful now are the ones who cure the information and create meaning to the clients. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, that's exactly it. And again, where there is different. It's a really important point that you've identified here. Is that different underlying conditions create demand for different kinds of skills. And so in a world where there's a huge amount of information, but it's very easily accessible. Yep. I mean, unbelievably easily accessible on your phone, on your tablet, on wherever. All right? Accessing information is no longer valuable. Now remember, in the old school days of sales, having access to the information was hugely important. Mm-hmm. The seller knew the invoice price of the car, the buyer didn't. The real estate agent had the password to the multi-listing service and could tell what houses were for sale. The buyer didn't. Mm-hmm. In this new world, a world of relative information parity, accessing information matters less than curating information. Taking this massive data, distilling it, detecting the meaningful patterns, helping other people make sense of it. That's a fundamentally different skill. It's a much actually more sophisticated skill. So, the other thing is, today, because of the surfeit of information, if people know precisely what their problem is, if I can specify precisely what my problem is, I can probably find a solution on my own. I don't need another person, a salesperson, to help me do that. However, if I don't know what my problem is, or as more often happens, I'm wrong about what my problem is, I need someone to help me figure that out. And so there's been a shift in sales, I think, throughout the workforce from problem solving as a skill, which is still matters, from problem solving to problem finding, identifying problems people don't know they have. And problem finding is much more of an artistic sensibility than it is a kind of an analytic spreadsheet sensibility.
Love that. Love it. A lot to think about. So let's talk about the second part of the interview here. What are, considering this new paradigm of sales and selling and influencing, what are the 3 things that our listeners right now can do to enhance their influence skills, salesmanship?
Yeah, there are all kinds of things. And actually in this book, what I tried to do is really lay out what I think is a compelling argument, but also try to give people as many tools and tips and exercises as they can to put it into action. So let me give you a few tactical things. So let's talk about attunement.
Okay.
All right, one of the best exercises that I've seen comes from Jeff Bezos. Who, again, attunement is how do you understand the perspective of others? And probably one of the best, certainly one of the cheapest, I think one of the most effective attunement exercises is something that Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, does.
Okay.
When he has meetings, important meetings, he will have his marketing people, his computer software people, his business executives. They'll sit around and have the meeting, but he will ensure that at that meeting, one chair is there and remains empty. And that empty chair represents the most important person in the room, the customer. And what that empty chair does is makes everyone think, basically put the customer in the room, attune people to the needs of the customer. And so when they're having a discussion, we should do this, we should execute this strategy, we should change this policy, the presence of that empty chair orients people to take the customer's point of view. I think that's actually quite a brilliant approach.
I love that.
And what I like about it, Roberto, again, my bias on a lot of these kinds of things is, especially for busy, smart adults, is that there's a lot of payoff in kind of exercises, tools, tips that are cheap and actionable, that don't cost a lot of money, that you can do right away. Try. If they work, keep doing them. If they don't work, don't keep doing them. I mean, I think this is a really great. Really great example of that.
Love it.
So that's one example. So let's go for the second one. Let's talk about. All right, let's talk about buoyancy.
Okay.
Buoyancy is how do you deal with rejection?
Is that then a question for me for a process better? Buoyancy, is that very similar term to resilience?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, that's it's related, I think. It's maybe a first cousin. It's not quite a sibling of resilience, but maybe it's a first cousin.
Okay.
And because resilience is it's not only the ability to withstand. Resilience is really the ability to withstand rejection.
Okay.
What I'm talking about is the ability to actually to withstand rejection, but also to remain sort of upbeat during the course of these kinds of things. And there's some very interesting evidence from especially the work of a scholar at the University of North Carolina named Barbara Fredrickson. And as you know, Roberto, from reading the book, the attunement, buoyancy, and clarity is really built not on my guesses about how the world works, but really on what is a couple of decades of social science tell us about how to execute these qualities. And the work of Barbara Fredrickson at the University of North Carolina tells us that for all, I sort of roll my eyes a little bit at, going overboard at positive thinking.
Okay.
And there actually is some power in, and I write about this too a little bit. There's some power in what some have called defensive pessimism about sort of negative thinking too. So I want to be.
I read that actually. I read that on Drive. Lawyers, they make more money when they're more pessimistic.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's a special case though, because those folks are miserable, and they're terrible salespeople too. What Fredrickson's work shows is that actually there is an advantage in positivity in terms of your effectiveness and your own well-being, but it abides by a certain ratio. So if you have, in the course of a day, let's say you have an even number of positive emotions and negative emotions,
okay,
all right, you're actually not much better off than people who have predominantly negative emotions in their life, even if you have a perfect match, okay? Now, this is very interesting. Now, let's say that you have a 2-to-1 ratio of positive interactions and positive emotions to negative emotions. So for every 2 positive interactions, for every 2 positive emotions, you have 1 negative emotion. You're actually not much happier or better off than people who have a predominantly negative. There's a certain ratio that she says. You got to get to 3-to-1. 3-to-1 positive to negative emotions. That's what keeps people actually high levels of subjective well-being and high levels of effectiveness. Now, at the same time, there's a ceiling on that. So if you go, and it actually ends up being a very high ceiling, higher than I would have expected. If you go above 11-to-1 positive to negative emotions, it actually works against you because it basically means you're delusional. Like life isn't that good. And so So buoyancy, to get to the heart of your question, buoyancy is about what you do before an encounter, what you do during an encounter, what you do after the encounter.
Okay.
How do you prepare yourself? How do you operate while you're in the encounter? And that's where the positivity comes in. And again, and so that kind of positivity is more than simply the ability to withstand negative. It's really the ability to be positive as a source of effectiveness. And then also, finally, on the third, what do you do after a rejection? And there's some very interesting research from Martin. It's old, but still very relevant and fascinating research from Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, who found that people's explanatory style really determines their sales success. He did a big study of a group of life insurance salesmen in Pennsylvania. Yeah. And what he found is that the best predictor of who was going to make it in that tough job was how they explained their failures. So if you explain, he calls it the 3 Ps. If you explain your failure as personal, pervasive, and permanent, all right, the 3 Ps, yep. Personal, pervasive, and permanent, you're not going to last very long. And what that means is that if you explain, let's say you go on a sales call and the person says, no way am I ever buying life insurance. Or if you say personal, oh, that blown sales call was entirely my fault. That's a less effective explanation than to say, assuming it's reasonably honest as it often is, listen, that guy wasn't going to buy from anybody. That guy was not in the mood to buy. All right? So one is a personal explanation for the rejection. The other is not personal. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about pervasive. If you say you get rejected in the sales call and you say after, oh my God, this always happens to me. I always get rejected. Okay. And chances are you probably don't always get rejected, but if that's how you explain it, you're going to be less likely to survive. If you say, listen, sales is a tough business, I'm going to get rejected more than I get accepted, but I've closed deals, I've sold stuff before, this is just part of the process. And then the final P, we have personal, pervasive, and then permanent, which is that, oh man, this is going to ruin everything. I blew this sales call and now my career is over, when in fact it's very rarely like that. And so if you explain things in terms of, it's all my fault, it always happens, and it's going to ruin everything, you're not going to last very long. Mm-hmm. But if you explain things and saying, hey, it's often more about the context than about my personal, than about me. Doesn't happen all the time, and a momentary setback doesn't ruin everything. You're more likely to survive. And I think what's interesting about that is that ended up being a predictor of who was an effective life insurance salesman, even more so than the typical kind of, equally so, I should say, to the subject matter, industry evaluation and assessment systems. And I think that how we explain negative events, as Seligman tells us, has a big effect on our buoyancy and therefore on our effectiveness. This is not a recipe. I'm not suggesting that we delude ourselves, but I do suggest that our explanatory style, when bad things happen, if we take a step back and explain them in ways that social science knows are both truthful and effective, okay. I think we can all be better off.
In the book, you do exercises on how to do that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The book has all kinds of exercises. So, and Seligman has a really interesting book called Learned Optimism, yep. Almost 20 years old, that goes into some of the research in even greater detail. I think what's happened is that kind of research has become doubly relevant in a world where we're all in sales now. So he did research maybe 25 years ago on these salespeople, and it got a little bit of attention, but not everybody was in sales. Now we're all in sales. We need to really heed this. We need to heed this research.
I love that. Thanks for the explanation, because when you mentioned the word buoyancy, I'm like, is that resilience? But now I understand. It's almost like is your capacity, in my own words, to have a very powerful, proactive mindset before, during, and after a sales event.
Yeah, and it's a mix. What's interesting is, and maybe this can be my third tactic here. Really interesting topic here. Let's talk about before. There's some really interesting research on this, Roberto. Okay. So when you go into it sort of challenges that view, again, just to emphasize to your listeners, I'm making these recommendations by looking at what the social science tells us. Okay. All right. And some of what the social science tells us confirms popular wisdom and folklore. Okay. Positivity is generally a good thing. Others of it contradicts it. And here's an example of where it contradicts some of the received wisdom. So let's say you're going into any kind of encounter.
Okay.
Right? Now, it could be a sales encounter. I'm going to try to, I'm visiting a prospective customer to try to get them to buy a computer system. Or it could be non-sales selling. I'm about to go in and pitch some ideas to my colleagues. Okay. I'm about to go ask somebody out on a date. Okay? Anything. So in advance. Now, the conventional view is that before we go into those kinds of encounters, we should pump ourselves up.
Yep.
We just say, you can do it. Awesome. Let's go.
Yep.
Tony Robbins, Stuart Smalley, it's what I call, the Bella Caroli school. You can do it. All right? And it turns out that from some fascinating research led by a woman named Dolores Albarracin, who is at, forgive my bad Spanish accent, who is at was at University of Illinois, now is at Penn.
Okay.
She and some colleagues did what I think is a fascinating piece of research that showed that you're actually, instead of going into an encounter saying, you can do it, you're better off going into an encounter asking, can I do this? Whoa! Now, Bella Caroli, Stuart Smalley, Tony Robbins, they're going crazy now.
Yep.
What? You're questioning your ability?
Yep.
This is wrong. But it turns out, if we take a step back and think about it, well, first of all, they show that people perform at a higher level if they question their abilities beforehand rather than if they simply affirm them. And the reason is this, that it's really the difference between active and passive. If I give myself basically a declaration, Dan, you're awesome, you can do it.
Okay.
That feels good.
Yep.
Hey, I feel pretty good about that.
Yep.
But it doesn't last for very long. And it doesn't give me any instruction about how to do anything. It's just simply an affirmation. Whereas if I ask myself a question, questions require some activity, even in our self-talk. When you ask yourself a question, if I ask a question, let's take this. If I say to you, wow, don't you think this is interesting? Now, you might not necessarily have to answer it, but you're thinking about the answer to that question right now, all right?
Yep.
There's activity going on. And so in our self-talk, when we ask ourselves a question, we have to give ourselves an answer. And what happens when you ask, can I do this, rather than you can do it, is that you answer the question. And so what happens, let's say I'm pitching some ideas to a colleague.
Okay.
I say, can I do this? I say, well, yeah, because I've pitched in meetings before and they've gone fine. Can I do this? Yeah. I know that Fred over there is going to be very resistant to this idea, so I have some really good arguments to try to persuade him. Can I do this? Yeah, I've actually spent a lot of time researching this. I know the material really well, and I believe in it. And so in the course of asking that question, you equip yourself with the tactics and the strategies to actually go out and do it.
Yep.
So instead of kind of luxuriating in this very brief, warm bath of affirmation, feeling good about yourself, actually it's more muscular. You begin saying, okay, let's talk about how I can do this. And it ends up being more effective. And it's what Albarracin and her colleagues in the research call interrogative self-talk. That declarative self-talk is actually less effective than interrogative self-talk. And this is, and I think it's very powerful. I've actually found this very useful to myself because questions require activity.
Yep.
There's activity, and affirmations are passive.
Yep.
You just receive them, you feel good, but it doesn't equip you to do the work.
How about someone, because this is fascinating, I never heard that before, so as you explain this, I'm thinking, okay. How about someone who has low self-esteem?
Yeah, good question. That's actually a really good question, and I think what the answer is well, first of all, I think it requires work on that person's part, and then maybe that person with a little low self-esteem needs not only self-talk but needs to talk to somebody else. So if she asks herself, "Can I do this?" I think actually in some ways that's more helpful to her because she begins thinking about, okay, can I do this? And so she needs to think about times she's done it before. She needs to think about times when it's gone well. But I think doing that with someone else is actually doing that with somebody else can be much more effective for people in that situation. But the other thing about the interrogative self-talk, which is actually very useful, which is this. If I am getting ready to pitch an idea in a meeting,
okay,
and I say to myself, can you do this? And I think about it because I'm active. And I say, and the answer is no. I should postpone the meeting. So it gives you actually kind of a warning sign that you're actually not ready. Whereas after, you can do it, you go, and how many times have we seen this? Somebody who goes into a meeting full of bluster and that kind of superficial self-confidence wastes everybody's time. And so it has that kind of effect as well.
Love that. Thanks for sharing that. I never heard that before. So
it's a cool one. Yeah, I really like it. And I've used it myself too. Because I sort of bought the folklore about, just sort of positive affirmation before something. But I find this much more powerful because what it does, it's just, the adjective I use is muscular. It's more muscular.
Okay.
You know what I mean? It's just...
It's almost like it's building, you talk about beliefs. It's almost like building up references, right? It's like a belief has references. So
it's a nice way to put it. Exactly.
So as you're asking, can I do it? Yeah, I done that. Can I do it? Yes, I done that. So ultimately become even more certain than just saying I'm awesome. Or
exactly. That's exactly what it is. It's a paradox in a way, in that the doubt can actually lead to greater certainty.
Yeah.
Okay. It's exactly as you're saying, and that's paradoxical for people. But when you unpack it and look at how it actually works, it makes perfect analytic sense.
I love it. So let's talk about the resource. First of all, I already ordered your book. Can't wait.
Thank you.
Can't wait. I highly encourage everybody who's listening to us right now, go get it. I read, like I said before, I read 2 books from Dan, Driving a Whole New Mind. They're awesome. And here's the printout, by the way. The book's not available yet. It's in December 31st, I believe, on Amazon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Amazon and any reputable bookseller.
I'm actually gonna put a picture here in the video. Daniel Pink, To Sell is Human, The Surprising Truth About Moving Orders, #1 resource. Second resource, I know Daniel you're always writing, so do you want to give the address for your website?
Sure, yeah. People can find, and on the book and on all the other kinds of stuff, it's danpink, DANPINK.com.
Cool.
www.danpink.com. You can, on this particular book, you can read the introduction. You can see a couple of videos. I've blogged a little bit about some of the key ideas in here. So there are all kinds of stuff to give your listeners, viewers, a taste of what's inside.
Love it. Any other resource that you recommend?
Oh, there are all kinds of resources on this. Let me recommend, I don't want to flog only my own book, but let me probably the best book on this entire subject matter, and it's a classic book, is a book by Robert Cialdini called Influence. And it's really one of the classic books that everybody in any kind of business should read. I read it years ago. I reread it. I actually went to a Cialdini workshop, which I really liked. I interviewed Cialdini, for a podcast. It's really a really important book, and I encourage everybody to pick up that book because it's just so good.
Love it. Daniel Pink, To Sell is Human. Dan, thanks so much for taking the time on Saturday to share your wisdom with us. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I cannot imagine a more fun Saturday morning.
I love that. Thanks so much, my friend. I appreciate that.
Thanks.
Thank you.